Big thanks to Barbara Fraser for agreeing to be with us today to talk about care creation, especially in these trying times of COVID. As many of you know, Barbara is a returned missioner who worked in Peru and is still working in Peru a lot of time. So I'm going to let her do her own introduction, though, and carry on. So thank you, Barbara.
Great. Thank you, David. Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation. This is really exciting. It's exciting to reconnect, and it's exciting to hear people from different parts of the world. I just want to throw out a few thoughts, and then I hope we can just talk about them and kind of see kind of where people's countries are and where people's thoughts are about some of these things. Yeah, I'm a returned missionary who never returned. I came to Peru in 1989, expecting to spend 3 years. It's been 3 really long years. And I stayed with Maryknoll until 2003. And since 2003, I've been freelancing as a journalist. And what I cover mostly are environment, public health, indigenous people, and the Catholic Church, because after all these years, I kind of know the Catholic Church in Latin America a little bit. And most excitingly, the last couple of years, I have done a lot of writing from the Amazon since about 2004. About 2014 was when I really started doing a lot of writing from the Amazon about oil spills in Peru particularly. And then as the Synod for the Amazon came up, I did a series of stories for Catholic News Service from reporting from the Amazon. And then I helped CNS with its coverage in Rome during the Synod. And that was really exciting because I got to do the fun stuff. I got to talk to the indigenous people who were there, the folks who were there from Latin America and from other parts of the world. And some of this reporting from the Amazon has really shaped my thoughts about some of the things I'm going to say today. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. There we go. Okay, so when I was thinking about talking today, and I thought about things that would have lots of figures and numbers and facts in them, and then I thought, no, right now the issue is the pandemic. The pandemic's just changing a lot of things. It's also laying bare a lot of things. I don't know how things are in your countries, but in Peru, we have just seen stripped naked all of the weaknesses in the healthcare system, in the social protection system, in all of the systems, and in the economy. Peru was the darling, of course, of Latin America for years, and the economic darling, and now we're going to be facing a really serious recession. And one of the things I'm concerned about with the recession is that in the rush to get people back to work and create an income for people, obviously the fastest thing to do is infrastructure, and that's what a lot of people are talking about. And one of the places where there's a lot of pressure to build roads is in the Amazon. And we all know that if you build roads in a tropical forest, sooner or later, where institutions are not strong, sooner or later, people come along and start building side roads out and opening up land for agriculture and for logging. And you get this herringbone pattern that is what has devastated large parts of the Amazon. So it made me think that maybe talking about caring for our common home in a time of pandemic might be something that we could kind of share some ideas about. And I'd like to introduce you to this woman. This is Doña Isaura. She lives on a river called, she's Quechua indigenous person. She lives on a river called the Tigre River in the northern part of Peru. And in the 1970s, an oil company came to start exploring there. And she was a girl at the time, and she remembers seeing these black stains, the river just sort of turning black from time to time with this scum on the top, and people would have to people who had to go to the river or to streams to draw water or to bathe or to draw water for drinking or for cooking would have to sort of push that scum aside to draw water. Whenever they asked people about it, people said, no, there was no problem. It wasn't, there was no danger. So nobody knew. Nobody knew what the hazards were. And she also remembers seeing the helicopters come. I visited that area in 2018 with a woman who is also indigenous, journalist who's also indigenous, who's from that area, who helped me a lot with the interviews. And she was able to get women to talk a lot more than I would have been able to. And the women all told about when they were girls, they would, some of them were were under 10, some were teenagers at the time. And they remember the helicopters coming, and most of them, they'd never seen helicopters before. One tells about how she ran and hidden the clothes that her mom was washing. Others, how scared they were when they saw people, these white men coming out of the helicopter or being lowered on ropes into their gardens. So that was in the 70s. And then in the early 1980s, the river, the stream, when they were drilling a well upstream from this woman's community, which is called Vista Alegre, which means happy view, the stream turned black. The lake where they fished turned black. People continued to fish because they didn't really have much choice. And then something happened. There was an epidemic, and virtually every child in the community died. Almost all the children, some of the older people. It hit the nearby army base too. So people who had their sons at the army base, some young men died. It was really tragic for the community. I heard about this from a biologist in Lima who's now in the Ministry of the Environment. But at the time, he was a Spanish Augustinian missionary in this area. And he had gone to this community, and he'd seen all of these little grave markers. And I wanted to hear about this. I wanted to know what the story was. So I went, and this woman took me to this place. After this happened and all the children died, the community moved. Indigenous communities at the time could move because the land was not as occupied as it is now. And when there was anything like that, an epidemic of anything, they would move the communities. So they moved across the river. And this area grew up again. But following her, I went with her, and I went with the leader of her community, who had never been here before. He was a younger man, and he hadn't been to the cemetery. So she was walking right behind him through this woods where there were no trails. And she would say a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. He was hacking away with his machete. And we got to a place where we could feel the ground a little bit uneven under our feet, just little sunken areas. She walked straight to this marker, and she said, "This is my daughter." And there was another marker like this that was it's a little inclined, it's sort of tilted. That was her niece. And standing here in the woods, she told us this story. And at the end, she said, "This is my daughter. She would be 35 today." And it broke my heart. This is the reason that I write about things like this. It's the reason that I do what I do. And the story I still can't tell the story without remembering the expression on her face and the pain, the very deep pain. These are people who suffered this enormous loss 30 some, almost 40 years ago. And because I'd heard of this story, and people had said, well, it must have happened approximately this year, approximately that year. She knew exactly when her daughter had died. And this is a trauma that these people have been carrying with them for 40 years. It's a piece of the history of the country that hasn't been told. It's not told. And yet it's this trauma that continues. And this is an area also that suffered from the rubber boom, when rubber barons from outside came in, enslaved the native people to the local people to gather rubber for them, and killed or maimed people who didn't meet their quotas. There's been a series of traumas in the historical memory here that don't get talked about. And I think the thing that the Black Lives Matter movement in the States has reminded me is that every country has its traumas. Every country has its people, its groups of people who are carrying this historical memory, who are carrying this trauma that hasn't been told. So one of the things that I think we really need to look at is environmental justice issues and where these stories are that need to be told. I really think that bringing about change is about telling stories. And some friends of mine who work in this area, also Spanish Augustinian missioners, told me that what guides their work is the question, who's suffering? And don't think this is news to any of you because it's what guides missioners' work everywhere in the world. But it's something that I try to keep reminding myself as a journalist also. I need to ask that question: who is suffering? Whose story needs to be told? And it's not that I am giving voice to someone, it's that I am helping to shine light on a place where people can tell their stories. So I think it's important to ask who's suffering, what the history is, and what people are carrying in their historical memory, especially at this time when traditional peoples are going to be suffering a lot from COVID. They're going to be losing elders who carry this historical memory with them and who carry the stories. Many of these things have to do with environmental injustices that's water, it's climate, it's desertification, it's loss of land, it's loss of access to resources, control, it's loss of control, autonomy over use of territory. And when you talk about environmental justice, the person who really put the environmental justice issue on the map his name is Robert Bullard, and he's a African-American scholar in the United States. And he was the one who talked about how communities of color tend to be most affected by urban pollution. And he talks, I heard him speak at a conference of the Society of Environmental Journalists a few years ago. And he talked about invisible communities. And I was talking with one of my friends in the Amazon about that. And he said, I don't think that's a good term for it, because these communities aren't invisible. They're there if anybody bothers to look. But what they are is, Spanish is such a great word, great language, because you can make an adjective out of anything. So he talks about them being invisibilized communities that have been made invisible. And if they've been made invisible, we can make them visible, help make them visible. One of the people who's given me a lot of insight into other ways of looking at our relationship with the natural world is a man named Leonardo Tello. He's the director of Radio Gumarda church-run radio station in the Amazon. And he's the one who it was his sister who went with me to visit Doña Isaura. And he's helped me a lot to understand how differently he looks at the world than I do from my Western perspective. About half a dozen years ago, I was doing a series of articles for mangabay.com, about the impact of protected areas on communities around them, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And we were talking a lot about conservation and conservation in natural areas. And he had been telling me about, going out to hunt or to fish and asking permission of the forest or asking permission of the lake to allow him to fish or to allow him to hunt and, take what he needed for his family. And finally I said to him, it took me a while to catch on, but finally I said, does the word conservation even have any meaning to you? The conservation as it's discussed as it's used in the United States or in Europe, does that word even have any meaning to you if you go out and you ask permission of the forest or of the spirit that protects the animals or the spirit that protects the fish in the lake? And he thought for a minute and he said, I don't think you can talk about conservation without talking about enchanted lakes. And I said, well, okay, tell me about the enchanted lakes then. And he grew up on a little island in the Marañón River, which is one of the big tributaries of the Amazon. And he said when his father was teaching him to fish, he taught him that there were lakes where you couldn't go to fish, or you could only go and take as many fish as you needed, and then you had to leave. And if you took more than that, then the spirit of the lake would make sure that you didn't fish again. And that lake might disappear. And I said, well, how do you know we're being very, very geo-referenced? I said, so how do you know where these lakes are? And he said, you don't. And it's not really important where they are. He said, well, sometimes you do. Some people do know lakes that close up seasonally. But he said, it's not really important, because just knowing that they're out there and that you might be in one is what creates the social pressure to not overuse resources. And that was when I realized that it was when the market economy reaches communities that the temptation to overuse resources occurs. When you're doing things for subsistence, you take what you need, and otherwise you can be tempted to take more than you need. And that's the quandary that traditional communities all over the world are facing. They need cash incomes now, and there's pressure on them to use their resources. And then they have people from outside coming in and really pillaging the resources. This is one of my favorite quotes from John Muir. When you talk about a single thing in nature, you find that it's attached to the rest of the world. And I think there's nothing like this pandemic. The pandemic, I said at the beginning, has really laid bare the issues that are the weaknesses in our systems. But the pandemic is also reminding us of the connectedness. On the one hand, this not being able to be with each other reminds us of how connected we are to each other. But at the same time, the pandemics arise because of broken connections in the world. This is a quote that I heard from this Christian brother. He, at the time, I don't know where he is now, but at the time, this is some time back, I was in Cochabamba, in fact, and I ran into him. And his name was Moy Hitchin. He was the coordinator at the time of the Christian Brothers Eco-Justice and Spirituality of Creation program. And he went around the world trying to help their schools develop environmental education programs. And he said, you have to love your local ecosystem. And I think this connectedness begins with us locally. And I think it's hardest maybe if you live in a city. I live in Lima, which is a city of 10 million people. It's a really difficult city to live in sometimes. And I think if you start asking yourselves, well, how did it come about? How was it formed? Where does the water come from? What are the endemic plants here? Can you name 5 plants that are typical or endemic to your area? Can you name 5 birds? Can you name 5 animals? How was it formed? How long ago was it formed? What are the minerals? What are the rocks? What's the formation under where you live? When you start asking questions like this, I think you start feeling a greater connection to place. And this connection to place and this ability to see ourselves connected to place begins to reflect much of what, we've got people who've been writing about this in the Christian tradition for thousands of years. And some of these things that Pope Francis has really brought out in Laudato Si and in the documents that came out of the Amazonian Synod. The Synod for the Amazon focused on the Amazon, but really the lessons are for the entire world. This is one of the quotes that I really like from the Synod the final document of the Synod, which got toned down a little bit in the exhortation that the Pope issued after that. But the Synod document is online on the Vatican website. There's a mystical meaning to be found in a leaf, in a mountain trail, in a dewdrop, in a poor person's face. The ideal is not only to pass from the exterior to the interior, to discover the action of God in our souls, but also to discover God in all things. And that, I think, is one of the things that this pandemic can teach us and can make us think about. The connection between the mountain trail, the dewdrop, and the poor person's face. The people who are suffering most from the pandemic are also the people who are suffering most from environmental degradation. And that's not an accident. Laudato Si points all of these things out, that climate change, that access to water, that exposure to pollution, erosion of biodiversity, the quality of human life, the inequities in the quality of human life, especially urban life, and the global inequalities are it's the people who are most vulnerable, the ones who are most economically vulnerable in our societies also. And there are consequences to these things. An attack on nature has consequences in people's lives. We need an ecological conversion. Both of these are also quotes from that document. And this is what gave rise to the pandemic. Pandemics, there are billions of pathogens that circulate in the natural world, but they only jump from their wild hosts to domesticated hosts, usually animals, and then to humans when their natural habitats are disturbed. And when the animals wild animals become sick, or when they become too crowded, or when they can no longer live a healthy life in their natural habitat, and the pathogens who don't want to be in an unhealthy animal hop to something else. And they have that opportunity when humans, of course, invade their space. The photo at the top left looks idyllic until you look at the space between the two meanders of the rivers, and you realize that those are small wildcat mining operations that are opening up there that just raise the forest. At the lower right is an African palm plantation in the Peruvian Amazon, kind of at the beginning of when it was just beginning. They had cleared it but hadn't started planting trees yet. And these are the kinds of frontiers, these are the borders between human lives and the wild, where these kinds of things happen because of the this kind of pathogen jumping can happen because of the enormous disturbance. So this call to an ecological conversion from the Synod, I think, is very important. And the other thing that was raised in the Synod, was placed in the final document of the Synod, but that didn't get into the exhortation, was the concept of ecological sin. The people who were at the Synod defined ecological sin as harm to the ecology, to the environment, that will have effects on future generations. And that, if anything came out of that Synod, the truth is, I think that was the most important concept, that certainly the one that would call us to the greatest accountability. And I was really sorry that it didn't make it into the exhortation. Everybody says, go back and read the final document anyhow, but I think a lot of people won't. But that concept of ecological sin, I just think is really, really, really important, and something that we as Christians can sort of hang our hats on. It's not that I like the negative part of it, and a couple of bishops told me that it didn't get into the exhortation because it was too negative, and it put things in a negative light and not a positive light. But I do think this whole idea of the sins of the parents visited on the children, in the case of the environment, that is true, and it's something that we need to be concerned about. This quote from Laudato Si, I think, is really important also. The fragility if we acknowledge the value and the fragility of nature, and at the same time our God-given abilities, we can leave behind the modern myth of unlimited material progress. A fragile world entrusted by God to human care challenges us to devise intelligent ways of directing, developing, and limiting our power. I like to think the pandemic is going to be a turning point. I'm not terribly, terribly optimistic, because I see countries trying to go back to business as usual, and I think we're going to be really surprised that it's not going to work, especially with the economic crisis that most countries are going to be facing. But it's still early in the pandemic. We're probably going to have this with us for the next few years, and there may be ways to start inserting wedges in the cracks. That line from the Leonard Cohen song, "There's a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in." If we can find those cracks, if we can take advantage of those opportunities, if we can work together doing that, perhaps we have some possibilities that will improve the world for these two little kids who are bathing in their river, on the Urituyacu River on the Peruvian Amazon. So I think we need to start asking, where are relationships with the natural world broken? Where is healing happening? And the concept of ecological sin is indeed a negative. I think it's an important, it's a powerful image, but it is a negative. So I think the way of flipping that is, where do we see the restitution being made for those sins? Where is healing happening? And how can we build bridges? And I think the bridges are really important, because there is healing happening in different parts of the world. And one of the things that we can do among ourselves is shed light on these things. We can shine lights on them. We can tell each other about them. We can help people learn from each other about these things. This is a concept this is a quote that came out of an interview that I did when I was doing a story about Laudato Si a long time ago, I think. And it's from an Argentinian climate scientist. He said, "Nowadays, my actions have effects thousands of miles away. My neighbor isn't only the person I see on the street. It's the person in the Philippines or Nicaragua who produces the clothes I wear, the person in Africa or Latin America who produces the food I eat, people in the place that produces the energy I use. Nowadays, the command to love my neighbor includes people I don't know. It's the globalization of love of neighbor. And I like that concept, the globalization of love of neighbor. It's something, it's sort of a theme that runs through all of Pope Francis's writings about these things. And it's interesting, I thought it was very interesting that it was a climate scientist who said it. He contributed to Laudato Si, to the climate part of Laudato Si. And so I guess the questions for us are, where do we see this kind of globalization? We've talked, the pandemic has shown the weaknesses in food supply chains. It shows the weaknesses in this globalization of things, but globalization of love of neighbor, globalization of these initiatives that do bring about healing. Where do we see those, and how can we share those, and how can we make those? How can we make them more visible and reinforce them? And be like these kids, these two little girls who are also splashing in the Urituyaku River that afternoon. So those are the thoughts that I have. They're not real down to earth, perhaps, but it's kind of what I was thinking about when I thought about the kinds of things that I know lay missioners are involved in around the world, and the kinds of things that the pandemic has made me think about. And I'd just like to kind of open it up to conversation and ask what you all think about it. So where do you see healing? I guess yeah. Let's start with the positive. Where do you see healing happening in places where there has been ecological sin? Where do you see the pandemic shining light on untold stories in your areas? What are the stories we need to be telling, or helping people tell, enabling people to tell? We really need to be enabling people to tell their own stories, not telling stories for them, really. I should be reading the chats. Thoughts?
Well, this is kind of a sort of more of a meta observation, but I think things like this gathering today just make it clear that we do have untapped resources for global conversations. And, to have you right in front of me, even though you're thousands and thousands of miles away, and you have told me stories today that I had not heard yet. And if we sort of start shifting to them, those of us who are do-gooders in the world, if part of our mission is to shine light on untold stories and enable people to tell stories. I don't really know where those stories are yet, but there are people who know that. But maybe we need to shift some of our energy to having forums like this, where we become the translators, where we become the bridge, which is what missioners often are, that enable someone who is overseas and maybe in a different place and has a different language to tell their own stories in their own words.
Yeah, I think maybe I like the idea of us being bridges. That image I like, and perhaps the lay missioners being a place where stories can be gathered for further telling.
This is Debbie. I think that a lot of times, from my experience in the United States, that um, people live mostly now in the suburbs or cities, and they're isolated from nature. Really knowing where their food comes from, knowing where their water comes from. Oh, it comes out of a tap. Um, And I've had conversations a few years ago. I live in a very my I grew up in a very agricultural area, and when I go to visit my mother, she has some friends who are farmers. And my discussion with them was very disappointing because they were at the time making fun of Al Gore and the idea of climate change. That they just didn't believe it. They just said, "Oh no, that he's a nutcase." Um, and so I asked them, I tried to come at it from a different way. I said, "What do you think about pollution? Do you like that? You know, oh, we don't like pollution." These are people that have been farming the land for generations, and they have a connection with the land, but not to see their land connected with all the other land. They just see it from their own little perspective. So how do we break people out of just their narrow vision of to a more global vision of the world, how their little piece of land is connected with the little piece of land in the Amazon or the little piece of land in El Salvador? Um, that's the thing. I think that's the connection, that they just couldn't make that global, or how the climate is worldwide, not just see it from their little plot of land.
Yeah, I think that's something that I have seen changing, even in the media in the past. I've been doing environmental writing since about 1997 here, but when I started freelancing, especially when I started doing environmental stories, because there were just oodles of great environmental stories out of Peru, it was really hard I write for English language magazines. It was really hard to get editors in the United States or in Europe interested in stories from the Amazon. I remember pitching a story to a science magazine, and the editor said, basically, "Why should I care?" And I wanted to write back and say, "You should care because you're the editor of one of the biggest science magazines in the world." But that wasn't enough for him. He wanted to know why his readers ought to care about the Amazon. It's a whole lot easier to make those arguments now than it was before. And there are lots of things that we can see, and climate is one, but there's this concept of flying rivers. And they talk about it over the Amazon, how the moisture that falls as snow over the Andes Mountains comes from the Atlantic Ocean. And part of it's picked up in the Atlantic and it's carried over the Amazon, but the Amazon actually makes its own rainfall too. As much as half of the moisture that falls on the Andes Mountains actually is evaporated out of the trees as they take up moisture from the ground, and they breathe it out they exhale it through their leaves. And they also exhale these little gas particles, this sort of vapor of gases that collects moisture. It accumulates moisture, so it sort of serves as a seed for moisture. And this moisture is carried over the Amazon. Some of it falls as rain in the Amazon, some of it falls as snow on the Andes. The stream of water, of air, curves around because of the Andes and backtracks, and it falls as rain also on Argentina, which is over on the Atlantic coast. It falls on their soy plantations. So the farms that have been spurring the deforestation are eventually going to lose their rainfall because they're destroying one of the sources of the rainfall, which is the forest. And that concept finally got sort of made graphic a few years ago by a Brazilian climate scientist, Antonio Nobre. And that whole idea that there are rivers in the sky that move moisture around was it really helped people sort of visualize what goes on in the Amazon. The same thing is true with Africa now, and it's dust. And the Sahara dust is getting to the southern coast of the United States now, and that's sort of putting it on people's radar screens, making people realize that the dust from the Sahara is picked up and it's carried around the world. It falls over the Amazon as an important source of fertilizer. I think it's phosphorus that's carried from the Sahara to the Amazon basin. And I remember first hearing about it from a woman who did research in the Caribbean on coral reefs, and she realized that seasonally the coral reefs would collect this sort of this layer of sediment on them, and she couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And then analysis showed that it was actually coming from the Sahara. So there are these circuits that go around the world that connect the different regions of the world with each other, biologically and chemically and physically, just as food chains connect us with other parts of the world in our, in our own biological sustenance. And one of the questions, of course, is how sustainable are local food chains? There are parts of the world where you can eat locally all year round. There are other parts of the world where people can't produce food all the way around, but all year round. But how do we make these things more sustainable? What are the options? What are the choices? Again, I think this pandemic it's breaking enough things that it's opening up some space for talk about where food comes from, and how it's processed, and who processes it, and who profits. There are just a lot of questions that can be asked at this moment, I think, that maybe weren't visible before.
I until recent, a few years ago, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Worked at Villanova University, and one of the things that I enjoyed most was we had a sister relationship with a community in Nicaragua. And I don't know how to get US folks beyond this hump, but I don't think people understood until they actually met other human beings and heard their story. And I guess maybe it could happen over Zoom, but it was especially powerful to go to that community because we had built enough trust where they were super honest with us. So in one trip, because of the changing climate, the rainy season is coming later. And so they're losing their crops of beans. And so the students offered, why don't we bring a lot of beans down to you? I'm thinking of food chains here, so that we can help you, since you've lost your crop. And this is what they said to us, and we were all taken aback. They said, but your beans are genetically modified, and we don't want to introduce them into our ecosystem. So these sorts of moments of insight that only come from conversations that don't happen in your day-to-day seem really important, and I'm not sure how to make those happen.
Yeah, I think again, it's the storytelling, and it's that constant shining light on these things. And I don't know how many people in the United States understand that a lot of what is driving migration to the US, and part of it is violence and things in countries in Central America, but out of Honduras, a lot of it is climate change. There's been a huge drought. There's been a huge drought. People lose their crops, and they don't have a lot of choice. And the traditional ways that people had to maintain resilience don't always work any longer. And I think of that community that Doña Isaura lives in that they moved across the river when there was an epidemic. And that's what Native communities have always done. Traditional communities have tended to do in the Amazon. If there was sickness, they moved. They didn't have a Western understanding of what made people sick. It was probably someone doing harm to self. It was shamanic, or it was someone robbing your soul. But they did know that they needed to move, and that also helped them biologically, certainly. And now that's hard to do. In some places, there are territories where, some places indigenous groups have large territories, and they can move around those territories. But in Peru, a lot of those territories are fairly small, and they can't move. When the pandemic hit here, it was interesting because there was really no plan for dealing with the pandemic, with illness on this scale in Native communities, in the indigenous communities in the Amazon. They're very difficult to get to. They can take many days by river to get to a community. They have the healthcare system in the entire country is weak. The healthcare system in the Amazon is extremely weak, or to non-existent. And the people who responded most quickly were the older people, because in the early 1970s, there was a measles epidemic in Peru. And when people heard about the measles epidemic, they took their children and they went into the forest and they built little shelters away from the center part of their communities. They built little shelters in the forest where they, in near places where they had crops, small plots of crops, and they kept their kids there for a few months. They hunted, they fished, they gathered cassava root, whatever they had in their forest. They gathered fruits from the forest, but they kept their children. The families isolated and kept their children away from the larger population, away from anybody who might have been able to come into the community until the danger had passed. And in a number of communities, it was the elderly people, the older people this time who said, let's close the community off, let's separate and go into the forest. Some communities tried to close, and government officials insisted on going there, which was an issue. It was a real problem because it didn't give the communities the autonomy to protect themselves. There was one watershed where the local mayor went on a boat, insisted upon handing out food baskets to people individually, and the crew on the boat was infected. There's some people in the crew on the boat were infected, and it was that mayor who introduced the coronavirus to communities in this watershed that had virtually no health care. There was one health center. The doctor from the health center immediately went to the communities to help. He didn't have protective equipment though, and he got sick, and the health center staff got sick. And it was only because the communities were not allowed to do what they wanted to do traditionally. There's also a problem in communities that there has been a tendency in some communities in some areas to rent out their lands to people to grow papaya or to grow coffee or to grow cacao for chocolate. And some of those communities no longer have enough land to be able to grow crops to subsist on. So that's another issue. And these traditional communities have their traditional ways of dealing with things like this, but their circumstances have been so disrupted by pressures from outside, economic pressures from outside, that they can no longer, that those traditional practices no longer make them resilient. So there's that as well. There's a question of what makes us resilient in the face of something like this. We have lots of time to think about it because this pandemic isn't going away anytime soon. So what are the things that could give greater resiliency to our own communities and to those of the people around us? What else? Flavio, what are you thinking there in Brazil?
Let me put my video so you can see.
Flavio, it's nice to see your face.
Yeah, it's such a complex issue. I'm just thinking about all these communities, both in the US and in Brazil, because thinking about also the Native Americans in the US also, who are still going through hard issues. It's all that you said, it's true all over the place in the Amazon. But in my state, we have indigenous people. It's like 1 hour out of João Pessoa. And they have a lot of land and good land thanks to the church. In the early 80s, our archbishop really helped them to get the title for their land. But now they rent some of the land for shrimp farms, for example. And it's all that you said, it's true all over. Unless they are very isolated in some places in the Amazon, but still the agribusiness is getting there. And I was thinking about what Irene said about not, I don't know, I think I lost who said about producing their own food or part of their food as a way to deal with this issue. And I was thinking also about the gospel, how food is so great and sacred in the gospel. All the time Jesus is getting people to eat and using food as a metaphor for the rain. And I think connecting spirituality to producing food, and that's what these indigenous people do.
Mhm.
They know how to connect what they eat and what they produce with their own spirituality. And it's fun when you said that when they get sick, some people say, "Oh, they stole my soul." In fact, they they have their soul stolen because food for them it's so part of their spirituality and their soul. So when people pollute their rivers and their land, in fact, they are really stealing their souls.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think it also, that's when we talk about bridge building, I think that's another place where actually an organization like Maryknoll can really shine light on this also. These food chains that go around the world, these food systems that supply chains that go around the world, how much do we know about where our food comes from? How much do we know about even when something has a sustainable label on it? How was that sustainability determined? And palm oil is, sort of the number one culprit in this right now. But in doing a couple of stories about palm plantations for an organization called the Center for International Forestry Research, which it's basically researchers who are doing research on plantations and on the effect of plantations on peatlands and things like that. And I was talking to a woman in France who she studies these certification systems. And basically she said the certification doesn't really work because consumers don't want to pay more for a product that is sustainably produced. So in the end, you get uncertified products mixed in with certified products when they get sold in a lot of cases. And that's another thing that I think we need to think about, particularly as as people who are privileged in a lot of ways to be able to go and live in other countries. Where are these connections happening? Where are the disconnects happening? And what's our responsibility in it as people? Not everyone in math is from the United States, obviously, but those of us who are from a more developed country, what are the stories that we really have, that we're sort of morally bound to tell? What are the things that we really can't live without telling if we're going to be true to ourselves? And these international supply chains, this international movement of things that affect people in the areas where we work or where people we know work. And I think those are stories that are really important to tell. And that's something that an organization like Maryknoll can do a lot to shed light on. What else? We're getting on toward an hour here. Maybe people.
I'd like to hear from Peg in El Salvador.
Yeah, I think the point about telling the stories is so critical. When people hear stories, it brings out their own, how they relate to it. And we've noticed here in El Salvador, we've been trying to work on a watershed management program. Of course, it's kind of waylaid right now because we're used to having face-to-face meetings with people and we can't do that. But one of the things that we did before we stopped meeting was just start to ask people in the community, what was the river like in the old days? And the older people would tell stories. Oh, we used to fish. Oh, we used to swim. Oh, we used to have lots of fun. But now there are parts of the river that have completely dried up. There's no water at all. And younger people sometimes have a hard time believing their elders. Oh, that can't be, how could there have ever been a waterfall here? It's just rocks now. But sharing those stories is so critical for people to understand intergenerationally and between different regions, geographically. And I think that's, it's the place to start. in order to enable people to start to open their minds, that the situation has to change. It can't go on like that. And I think enabling people to still tell stories is a key role. And I'm one who kind of resisted at first. I mean, we had an agenda at one particular meeting, I know, and we had several things we wanted to cover. And then the older people started talking, and as they do, they ramble and they tell more and and that provoked somebody else to tell another story. And I was kind of anxious to move on until I was corrected by someone in our group who said, no, this is really important. The people need to tell their stories and we need to hear them. And that was a really good moment for me. I mean, in the moment, I didn't think so, but in retrospect, it was, because that was a key teaching to take away, that we have to slow down and stop and listen and look and see what's really happening around us. And until we do that, all the ideas for changing things are not going to go anywhere. I mean, we've been banging our heads against the wall, telling people they really need to recycle all those plastic bottles if they can't stop buying soda. But until they see where all those plastic bottles end up in the ocean, it doesn't have an impact. And I think they have to hear the stories, they have to see the pictures, they have to feel the pain of loss in order to really say, okay, it's time to change. What can I do? How can I be a part of the picture? So thank you for talking about telling stories. I think it's really key.
Thanks. And something that you've said is also really important there, and that's people tell the same story in real different ways. When I talk to women on the Tigre River about, we started just asking them, what do you remember from when the company arrived, the oil company? How did the oil company arrive? That was the question we asked. And the women always started out with, the men always started out with, well, these people arrived and either they offered us work or they refused to offer us work. Those were the two things that happened there. That was the way every man started his story. These people from the company arrived and they either offered us work or they didn't. The women started their stories with, I was down at the river washing clothes. I was in the kitchen cooking. I heard this noise. I was only a girl. I was out in the garden. Every woman started her story that way, where she was, how she reacted, what she felt. And I think I've been doing this for a long time, but I think I had never really seen as starkly as that how differently people told the stories. You talk about generational differences. That's another thing. A person who's in their 80s is going to tell about that place very differently from a person in their 20s. And we need to listen to those too. And children. I don't interview children very well. I've never had kids. I've never, I have nieces and nephews and I have godkids, but I just don't have the knack for getting stories out of children. But when I first went to an oil spill the first oil spill I went to in the Marañón Valley, which was where I met the director of that radio station. At the time, there was this young woman from Germany. She was just out of high school. She was 19 years old, doing an internship with them. And she was a marvel. She could sit down and get kids to talk about their feelings about this oil spill and what they saw and how they felt and things. Like, it was just incredibly natural for her. And the kids just told about it a different way. So it's just so important to get to listen to that story from different angles, and for people of different generations to hear the stories from other angles too.
And now I'd like to hear from Steve or somebody in Africa to talk about the situation there.
Yeah, I would really like to hear what's going on with the pandemic there too.
If I may, this is Dee. Hi. I guess I hear what you're saying. I get it. But I work more with climate-induced migrants and the gaps that, with the national law, international law. This climate control, climate claim, what's happening with the displaced people due to that, especially in South Sudan, due to drought or flood. People move over 8 or 9 times. And with the flood comes the locust, then there's the eating of the grains, and then they move again. You have these pastoralists that cannot make, not even get enough water to drink every day. So we can tell those stories, but I think it's a point where we have to move past those stories and look at national environmental policies, looking at the states and see what they doing, what preparation do they have in place to move people to have food or to provide for themselves.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, and thanks for bringing us down to earth with this. And as a journalist, I'm sort of a professional storyteller, but what I hope my stories will do, and I think what we all hope will do, is to have some kind of an impact. And if storytelling, the way Pam was talking about it, is a way of helping people understand their own situation. But I agree, we need to go past that and need to turn these things into policies. One of my greatest frustrations as a journalist is that rarely do I see that kind of impact. I think my coverage of the oil spills helped make the state-run company aware that somebody was going to be going to these oil spills and watching and talking to people in the communities. I think it helped make them more accountable. But it's really hard for just the publicity, just telling the stories to have an impact. And it does need, these things do need to be turned into policy. And that's going to be a huge challenge after the pandemic too, because there's going to be a lot of economic pressure to keep things as they are. And I think there's going to be a lot of need for advocacy and political work to change policies and to change the way we're doing business.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Steve. Your last statement about change the way we're doing business made me think of, well, not really my experience here in Africa, but when I was in graduate school, I worked with dairy farmers in Vermont. And one of the farmers I worked closely with he was changing their family farm from a conventional farm to a organic farm. And it was a huge investment. It was like $250,000 that they had to invest over 3 years. And it was like, and he said they mostly, the farm had like 3 brothers, or 2 brothers and a partner. And it was really interesting. Their perspectives were all different. Like, one was kind of like doing it for intrinsic reasons, and the other 2 were kind of like doing it for business reasons. Mm-hmm. And they said, to survive, we're going to get into the organic market. And this was 10 years ago, and I'm still in touch with them a little bit. And they did survive. And like most of the farms in Vermont have not. It was like every year it was like 10% were going out of business. And then I had another friend from graduate school that he started a company to do like farm to plate food, mm-hmm. Local food. Yeah, and it was really, really hard. Like he started on his own and maybe bought like a little truck, and it was like the rest of us were going off and getting like some big like NGO job or something. And now he has a viable business. I'm not sure how it is in the pandemic, but him and his wife, they like lived in a trailer for a while and stuff, and it was really hard. But I think this actually, like, instead of just showing people bad stuff and saying don't stop doing the bad things, it's like there has to be a viable alternative. And it's not always an easy one, but sometimes over the long term it's actually the better one in so many ways. So
Yeah,
it made me
it's,
think of it.
yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I have friends who live up a hill outside, up a hill, up a mountain outside Lima. They're a couple of hours outside of Lima. And when I met them, they were basically subsistence farmers, but they were part of a little group of farmers in their community who were switching to organic farming, largely at the urging of a nonprofit organization here in Lima. And I was doing a story about sustainable development initiatives in that watershed, and somebody had told me about them, so I climbed the mountain to talk to them. And I found myself in a field of Brussels sprouts, and I love Brussels sprouts, and I hadn't seen a Brussels sprout in this country in 14 years. In the 14 years I had lived here, so I was really excited to be in this field of Brussels sprouts. And the man who owned the field of Brussels sprouts, he saw an economic option in organic farming. He saw that there was a market niche in Lima, and that Lima was reachable. It was a couple hours away, but it was still within striking distance. There was one man in the community who had switched to organic farming because he was having health problems. He was having lung problems, and his doctor told him it was probably due to the chemicals. And there were these two brothers who said to me, "Senorita, we're Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Bible says we shouldn't do anything to harm our neighbors, so we've decided to switch to organic farming." And I loved that variety of reasons. Some of them, the organic farming didn't work for them, and they switched back to conventional farming, or they do sort of a combination of things. But the family with the Brussels sprouts has stuck with it. And the interesting thing about them is that they were selling in an organic farmers market in an upscale neighborhood in Lima. And over the years, they've been selling there for almost 20 years. And over the years, they've done very well. They've gone from basically subsistence to being able to have their own truck, so that they no longer have to take their vegetables on 4 different vehicles and jump from vehicle to vehicle and public transportation to get to the farmers market. But the pandemic has given them the impetus to start home delivery. It was something they'd always wanted to do. They just never had the chance to, they never had the time to do it, selling at the farmers market and working in their fields. But now it's given them another niche. So yeah, so it's interesting how people are finding ways of using this new, I'm not even going to call it the new normal, because I don't think we know what the new normal is yet. But these new situations, they see a crack and they sort of stick their foot in it, and they see a crack in the door and they stick their foot in it and kind of wedge it open to see if there's something there that'll work. And yeah, and these people who they were subsistence farmers 20 years ago now have, they now have a business, and their kids want to go into farming. Their neighbors' kids want to drive taxis, but their kids want to continue with the farm. So there are things like that happening too. What else? Anybody else, or people kind of talked out here?
Okay, going once, going twice. Anybody else have anything to say?
I have something, but I'm hesitant to bring it up because it's all so new to me. I just completed a little mini course by an Irish anthropologist, sociologist, missionary priest. And Susan has taken courses from him as well. A wonderful man, and he a lot of his basis is in creation, evolution, and creation, and what are we learning. But this particular reflective thing, which was just last week, and I'm still trying to put my notes and stuff together, is on the pandemic. And he starts out, Barb, the same way that you did, about how these pandemics occur. And one of the points he made, and I don't want people to misunderstand this is why I hesitate to bring it up. I haven't really fully, developed his, or fully understand what he was saying, but he talks about things like that happen, and that what we should be doing in response is befriending things that happen and find ways to work with them, around them, whatever. He told one actually rather dramatic story about a particular place where there's a certain fruit that comes out every 40 years. And when that fruit comes out, maybe you know of this, the rats go wild, they love it, and then they start rapidly reproducing because they go and gorge themselves and it causes them to reproduce, whatever. And then they wipe out the rice fields, the mice, So it was coming up on the 40-year time, and one of the government people hired this scientist to find a way to kill the rats. And he said, no, I don't think that's the way we should approach it. He said, we need to, what he said is find a way around it that's a little more natural. And what he did was encourage the people to plant their crops that year a couple of months early before this fruit. And they did, and they saved the crops, And so he was talking a little bit, things like that. He had several great stories, but one of the things he talked about was the vaccine. He said, I know everybody's waiting for a vaccine, and it will be helpful. But if that's what we're seeing as the solution to this problem, that means are we seeing it as we get a vaccine and then we can go back to life as usual and doing what we've been doing? And this is our invitation to find other ways to, as he says, befriend paradoxes.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And in a lot of cases, it's sort of like what people say about natural disasters. And there's nothing, they're not natural disasters. They're usually when there's flooding that displaces people or other things that displace people. It's because people are it's not nature that's doing this. It's often people in Peru. It's always people living in floodplains. Yeah, there's a flood there. It only floods every 50 years, but if you're there when it floods that year, then you're going to get washed away. It's how we live in these ecosystems. It's how we live on this earth. My hope is that in a post-pandemic world, we will learn to live more lightly on the earth. The way I see countries talk about reopening as if they just sort of been closed for the holidays, or trying to go back to restart our economies and go back to what we were doing before, the more I think, the more pessimistic I become about it. And yet again, we're at the beginning of the pandemic. We're only a few months into it, and pandemic, the 1918, 1920 flu, that went on for more than 2 years, and it was multiple waves. And there's no guarantee that we'll have a vaccine. Well, there's no guarantee that we'll have a vaccine that works. There aren't, there's no vaccine for the common cold, which is another coronavirus, and people have been looking for cures for the common cold for a long time. So we may need to learn to live with this. And so what do we need to change in our behaviors? What do we need to adapt? I hear the same thing in my indigenous friends and the people who I've met during these oil spills. Things that I find annoying, or things that we would eliminate in cities, perhaps, they just learn to live with. An animal comes and takes food out of their garden. Well, the animal is part of the world, and that has to do with the way they view animals, because there's animals in almost all of the origin myths many origin myths of indigenous people in the Amazon, for example. This is probably true in other places too. The stories start out long ago when animals were people. And then the animals were the ones who sort of shaped the natural world, who the woodpecker that pecked in the tree and the sap ran out and that formed the river, that sort of thing. So animals are like us. I mean, they can, and some animals can become people. There's that in the cosmovisions of some of these people as well. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. I mean, how much can we embrace? And how can we learn to live? How can we look at the ways in which we have disrupted ecosystems and find ways to make them more livable for ourselves and for others. Because I think Dee's point is really well taken. There are a lot of people who are being displaced by these issues, and we do have the power to change that. But it requires a change to our economic system, and it requires a change to our comfort levels in a lot of cases. And how, I'm weathering the pandemic in Lima without any problem because I live in a neighborhood that, I have an income, I have some savings, and I have an apartment in a neighborhood that's where I can stay protected. And most of the people in the country can't. And I recognize that, so there's a privilege, there's a certain privilege there, and with privilege comes an obligation, I think, to start looking beyond these things for other solutions. I have a question for Steve. I meant to ask you that. Where did you do your master's? Is Steve still with us?
Yeah, I went to the School for International Training.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Most of my colleagues for the practicum phase, we had like a field stuff and then go to write your capstone. And most of my colleagues were going off to a exotic location. And my wife was pregnant with our twins at the time. So
that was exotic.
I didn't do that. But when I gave my capstone, I said, when I did the background of Vermont, I said, Vermont is the size of Rwanda.
Very good. I was curious because I did a long distance master's from Green Mountain. Their
okay. Yeah, sure.
Environmental studies program about 10 years ago.
Oh yeah, it was about the same time.
Yep. Great. Well, don't know if there's anything else.
Barbara, do you have anything to kind of wrap things up, or
no,
final words, wisdom?
No, thanks very much to all of you for your time, for sharing your ideas, and all best wishes to all of you in your work in these and to the people you work with in these very difficult times. And I think this is it's a really difficult moment. I hope it's a moment that gives us an opportunity to do things differently as well. I think it's important for people who feel the same way to find each other in the world. The Maryknoll Commissioners, or Maryknoll in general, is one way for people to find each other in times like these and try to build things together. And yeah, look forward to staying in touch.